Let's see, moving on. I have done a little bit since the last video. Mostly what I've been doing is creating a little bit stronger washes of the main color of each petal. I'm not sure which ones I've done it since last video. I know I've done the blue-violet, and I think several others, including probably the red-orange, maybe the orange, maybe most of them. But as you can see on this blue-violet, I'm also starting to shift into trying to dab a little bit of extra paint around the edge of that petal. So I'll show you what I'm talking about with just the straight violet here. And for the violet, I'm going to be mixing, once again, a combination of the Quin Rose and Ultramarine Blue. Don't want it to be leaning towards red and don't want it to be leaning towards blue. So maybe that's a good amount. I'm going to try to make a little bit more though, so I have plenty. It seems maybe a little too red still. It seems okay. I think I'll start with that. Make it a little more watery. I did come on that blue violet. That was probably a little darker than I in hindsight would have done. But either way, here's what I'm sort of doing now is I'm strengthening up each petal with the main color, strengthening it, but not going too dark. That's a very technical, objective definition. Too dark. Covered that nicely and quick. Gonna soak up this pooling color, most of it, but then I am going to try to make sure that I get most of the water out of my brush. If I come back and dab a little bit along the sides, if I time it right and I don't bring in too much wet color, it will want to dry nice and consistent. The other way I could go about doing that is something I'm going to have to do in a subsequent video with a smaller brush, because I'm not sure where I just put my smaller brush. But I will use the smaller brush, do a sample of that in probably like the blue-green. But just starting to strengthen it up with a little bit more concentrated color. And dabbing in a little bit of paint around, a little bit more paint around the edge of that shape. Kind of fun. So let me get my number 4. That wasn't so hard, but I will do the blue-green, and I think that's dry enough to not move around as I shift the paper around. So blue-green is going to be a little bit of the yellow. That's what I have right there, is way too much yellow. So I'm going to bring in a bunch of the peacock blue. I may have started with something that was just a little too yellow, because I definitely want it to be bluish and greenish. The first layer doesn't seem so blue-green right now, but that's what happens as you start clarifying what colors. I'm spinning this around, classifying. I'm not sure where I started with that. Strengthening. When you start making it more obvious what each color is, it becomes more obvious what each color isn't. So, I don't think you're overlapping you. Nope. That's my blue-green. Very light touch over the existing. I'm not going to worry about that too much. Over the existing layers. And then I'm going to get my smaller brush, and the reason this can be helpful is because when I'm trying to bring in just a little bit of extra paint into these edges, this smaller brush by definition will not hold nearly as much water as the larger brush. So it's a little bit trickier to manage the amount of pigment and water that comes out of this larger brush when you're dabbing it in that way. And if you introduce, it's easier to introduce excess water, which will not be helpful. Sort of make you struggle on the whole thing. It'll introduce various and sundry things that you don't want. That's drying just a little bit odd to me, and I think it's wet enough so I can drop in a little bit more there. Looking at it sideways, and you'll be able to tell when you're looking at it sideways just how wet or how not wet it is. Sometimes you can really sort of shift it. I'm not sure how well that's showing up in the video, but you can shift it around to try to, I mean, mostly one of the main reasons I do this rotating it around is to try to reestablish kind of a consistent distribution of the moisture, consistent enough so that it won't dry with wacky back runs. Wacky Back Runs. Good name for a band. I think that's all I'm going to do on that one. And indeed, I think I'm going to hit pause and kind of go on to the next step. Okay.